Hi everyone, welcome back to Elizabeth Ann Can Stitch. In today's video, I am going to be making a baby quilt from start to finish. This will be a little bit of a vlog style sew with me and a tutorial, so you guys can make your own quilt if you'd like to. I have all of the instructions written out in the description box below this video if you would like to use and reference those. I am working on a PDF version of the free pattern, but I don't have that available right now, so you can always follow me on Instagram at Elizabeth Ann Can Stitch if you are looking for more information on that. But this quilt is easily adaptable into many different size blocks and of course many different layouts. I got the idea for this quilt pattern from a quilt that I actually found on Pinterest, and I will show you what that one looks like right here, and I will have her free tutorial linked in my description box below as well. I wanted to simplify mine a little bit and not do everything on point, so this quilt looks like it's on point, but all of the blocks are straight set, which makes it really easy to put together. So for the quilt I'm making today, you just need 4 fabrics. I recommend a dark, medium, and light of one color or kind of color family, and then one background print. Then just pick out some backing and binding that you like to go with it. My nephew Andy really wanted to run errands with me a few weeks ago, so he actually came and helped me pick out all of these quilt fabrics. After I got the fabrics home, I just started cutting everything out. So while making this quilt, I became very curious about just how long it would actually take. So I started timing everything that I was working on, and I included those times in the video for you just to give you an idea of how long it took me. So I'll let you know at the end of this video just how long it took me to make this quilt. Enjoy. Okay, so we have all of the fabrics cut out for the quilt, and we're just making 2 blocks. We're making an hourglass block and we're making a 9 patch. And so these are the pieces we need for the hourglass block. These are the pieces that will make our 9 patch. And I'm gonna start by making all of my hourglass blocks first, and then I'll come back and do the 9 patches. To make these hourglass blocks is super simple. Basically, 2 of these squares paired together is going to make 2 hourglass blocks. And so the first step is actually going to be to sew these together. But before I do that, I am going to mark a diagonal line from point to point on the back of these white squares. There's a couple different ways you can mark your center line. I have another quilt that I made that I did tutorial videos for that made hourglass blocks, and in that one I actually ironed my blocks in half to create the crease line, but that was also because those blocks were 18 inches square, so quite large, and it was just easier to deal with rather than drawing a line. The other method I like for sewing triangles is to use the diagonal seam tape by Cluck Cluck Sew. It's always on my machine, and that works great, but with smaller squares. When you have this large, you won't be able to see on your diagonal seam tape from point to point, and so I like to go ahead and mark my line just to make sure I'm more accurate with my sewing. And there's only I think 13 of these that we're pairing up together, so it won't take me too long to mark these by hand. I'm just going to use one of my friction pins, my heat erasable pins, and I'm going to use a ruler. Honestly, you can use any kind of pen you want because this will actually be cut away. It won't actually ever be on the fabric that'll be shown. So you could really use whatever kind of marker you want, but I love these friction heat pins. So to make the hourglass block, we are going to take one of each of our squares, and I'm gonna layer the squares right sides together with that line we drew facing me. And then I am just going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of this line. And you don't have to be absolutely 100% precise because we will be squaring everything up later. Like there is a little bit of a room, you know, a margin for error, because we will trim these down and square them up later. But I try to just make sure I'm sewing about 1/4 inch away on either side, and then everything will work out really nice. And so I'm going to chain piece. So I'm going to do all 13 of these on one side, and then I'll flip them and come back and do the other side. Okay, so one side is sewn. Now I'm going to take all of these and sew down the other side with a 1/4 inch seam. Hi guys. Okay, so we have all of our squares sewn together, and we're going to cut these apart and make half square triangles. That's the first step to making the hourglass block. So you can take these over to your cutting mat and just simply use your rotary cutter and a ruler to cut down the center of these squares, but I decided I would just cut them with my scissors. I mean, lining up the ruler and the rotary cutter probably takes just as long as using regular sewing scissors. So that's what I'm gonna do. Yeah, so let me cut these apart and get them pressed into half square triangles, and then I'll show you the next step back at the sewing machine. Okay, so now that we have all of our half square triangles all nicely pressed open, I haven't trimmed any of the dog ears. I haven't trimmed them down to size. I'm gonna work with them just as is. We're gonna turn these into hourglass blocks. So this is what they're gonna look like. I've done a couple testers and I have trimmed these down to size. I wait till I sew them into hourglass blocks before I square everything up. I just find it unnecessary to square the half square triangles at this point, because you'll likely still want to square these up after they're hourglass blocks. So might as well just do it all in one step at the end. So to create 2 hourglass blocks, you need 2 of your half square triangles, and you are going to layer them together, right sides together, so that your darks and lights are opposite of each other. And you can see if you just fold back one corner that that's going to give us our nice hourglass block. Really, the most important thing is making sure that your center seam lines are as perfectly lined up as you can get them. And so what I do is I kind of lay them out where I think they go, and I peel up a corner, and I just basically make sure that everything is nice and lined up as much as possible. If you are more comfortable with pinning, then what I would do is pin the corners where the seams are. We're actually going to be sewing across opposite of the seams we just made. So to keep my pins out of the way, I would probably stick one over here on this end. And I'm not going through the seam with my pin just because the seam is bulky and can kind of distort where your pin is, and can move your fabrics out of place. So I'm pinning right next to the seam. And so I can pin right here. And so now my 2 blocks are ready to go to the sewing machine. And we're really just going to repeat what the process we did for the half square triangles. We're going to, if you want, you can mark your center line. Actually, I think I will mark a center line. Let me grab my ruler and pen. And so these half square triangles aren't going to be perfect. You might be able to see down here, I'm about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch off. It's totally fine. We have enough excess that we'll be able to trim everything square. So I'm just going to find, in general, the center point from corner to corner, going perpendicular to that line we've already sewn. And I'm using a friction heat erasable pen. And now when we go to the sewing machine, we just need to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of the center, and that will create our 2 hourglass blocks. I'm just making sure that my open seams are staying nice and open and flat as I sew, as I kind of get closer to the center there. And I'll probably chain piece the rest of my hourglass blocks, but just I'm just going to show you guys one of them. So I'm not even going to break the thread. I'm just going to turn this around and sew a 1/4 inch on the other side. Okay, so again, you can go to your cutting mat and use a rotary cutter to cut these apart. I am just going to use my scissors for right now to show you. So I'm just going to cut straight down that line in between our 2 seams. And now you can see that we have 2 hourglass blocks. Perfect. So I am going to do that to the rest of these pairs, and then we'll go back to the ironing board to press and talk about trimming everything to size. Okay, so we have our stack of hourglass blocks, and we want to trim them down to 6.5 inches square because all of the blocks, all the finished blocks in our quilt are going to be 6 inches. So I am going to trim these to 6.5 inches. All you need is some sort of square ruler. I happen to have a 6.5 inch square, which is perfect, so I'm going to use that one. But you can also easily use a 12.5 inch square, 10.5 inch, whatever size square ruler you have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the 45-degree marker on my ruler, and I am going to find the center point of the 6.5 inch square and make sure that I'm lined up in the center of my hourglass block with a 45-degree angle lined up on one of my seam lines. Perfect. And so I'm going to go ahead and trim. And now I have my nice finished 6.5 inch hourglass block. Okay, so here we have 25 trimmed 6.5 inch hourglass blocks, and because we made them in pairs, we have 1 extra in case we need it, but you'll need 25 for the quilt. Now let's talk about the alternate block in the quilt, and that is this little 9-patch kind of plus sign block. And it could not be simpler to sew. It's just a 9-patch. We can kind of chain piece. We can do 1 block at a time, kind of your call, however you want to sew it. I will probably chain piece mine. And I do have all my little squares stacked up. I sorted them into the right numbers, into piles. And so I'm just gonna set up on my cutting table here my block, how I'm going to sew it together. That way I can just grab, you know, these 2 piles and sew all of these squares together. Then I would grab these 2 and sew those together. And then these 2. And then I would sew these, and then rows and rows. And there we're going to have our 9-patch block. Super, super simple. So yeah, let's take this over to the sewing machine and get to piecing all of our 9 patches. So now I have the first 3 segments of my block sewn together. So I'm gonna get all of these pressed and add the 3rd block. I got this new wool pressing mat on a recent shopping trip, so I'm gonna test it out while I get all of my little chain piece squares pressed open. Okay, so now that I have all of these pieces sewn together, I'm just going to sew this to this, this to this, and this to this, and press again, and I'll be back. So now I have all 3 of the rows I need, and now I'm just going to sew them together. So I'm going to start with these 2 rows. I'm going to set these aside for now. And so to sew these 2 together, I'm just going to eyeball to line things up. All you have to make sure is that your seams meet here and here. It's just 2 points. These are 2.5-inch squares. You can definitely pin this if you're more comfortable, but I am just going to eyeball it. And so what I'm going to do is line up one side and pinch it really tightly, line up the other side and pinch it really tightly, and then I'm gonna kind of just line these ends up a little bit. And I'm still holding on to this first intersection. I can let go of the second one for now. I really am just caring mostly about this top one. And I'm gonna start sewing and making sure that everything stays nice and lined up. And as I get to the second intersection, I am just lining up my seams perfectly, and I'm gonna hold it right there in place as I sew towards it. And once I have the needle down in that seam holding everything together, I'll just adjust and make sure my ends are lined up. And I am going to chain piece these, but I will just show y'all really quickly how that comes together. And you can see it lines up nicely. I'm going to sew the rest of these together, and then we'll add the third, and then we'll have our block done. Okay, so now let's add the third row. And I'm gonna do this the exact same way as before, just kind of eyeballing to line up my seams with each other. So like in this situation, let me fold this back so I can show you. These seams aren't gonna match perfectly. I don't know how well you can tell on camera, but there's like not even a 1/16 of an inch, maybe a 1/16 of an inch on each side. And so instead of having one match up perfectly and the other be off by 1/8 of an inch, I'm gonna split the difference. And so when I line up my seams, I'm gonna cheat off to the left side a little bit of this one and off to the right side a little bit of that one. That way it looks more even though the seams won't match up perfectly. I'll show you what it looks like in a second. And so now you can see they're not exactly perfect, but it looks pretty dang good. So that's how I eyeball when I sew these together. Okay, let me do the rest and we'll have all of our blocks made. Okay, so now we have all of our blocks complete. You should have 25 of your hourglass blocks and 24 of your 9-patch blocks. I'm going to be doing a 7x7 layout, so we need 49 blocks. Since these are just 2 different blocks, I don't need to lay everything out to kind of assess fabric placement or anything like that. I already know my layout. I am just going to lay a few out to see what it looks like, and then I'm going to stack up all of my rows and get them ready to sew the quilt top together. Okay, this is looking so cute. I am 100% going with the original layout that I selected. And so obviously you can see it is just an every other pattern, but one thing to keep in mind is that one row, your hourglass blocks will have light going vertical and dark going side to side. And then on the other row, it flips so that the dark fabrics are vertical and the light fabrics are horizontal. And I think that creates a really nice square and a square look. It almost looks like this quilt is on point, but it's not. So yeah. Okay, I'm gonna stack up all of my squares into their rows so I can take them to the sewing machine and sew the quilt top together. Okay, so the way I like to piece the blocks together in my quilt is to do each row, take them to the ironing board, press all my seams open, and then attach all of my rows, starting at the top, working my way down to the bottom. So that's how I'm gonna do this here. I've got my 7 rows stacked up next to me. I'm just gonna grab them one at a time and start sewing my blocks together in order so that everything turns out as I planned. Again, I am not going to pin anything here. These blocks have no seams that you need to match up. We'll only need to match up seams when we sew our rows together, so I will be pinning then, and I'll show you that when I get to that step. Okay, so now I have my first row sewn together. I am just going to double check and make sure all of my hourglass blocks are pointed the right direction, and they are. So now I'm just going to do this to the next 6 rows and I'll get them all together. Okay, so I have all of my rows sewn together, and now I am going to sew each row to the next one to create my finished quilt top. So I'm going to start with my first 2 rows, and I'm going to show you how I pin them before I take them to the sewing machine. So I start by laying the 2 rows on top of each other with the side I'm going to be sewing closest to me, because that's how I like to pin. And since this quilt has 7 blocks, we do have a center block. So that's where I'm going to start with my pinning. So all I'm going to do is kind of pull and adjust and get this kind of perfectly centered. And I'm going to pin right into the center. And I'm going to work my way down to the right side first. And so I want to pin at every intersection. I've pinned in the center, and so I'm going to pin all the way down on the far right seam intersection next, and then I'll work my way back towards the middle. So start in the middle, go outside, and then I kind of work my way back in. That's how I like to do it. Okay, so now I'm going to scoot this down, and I'm going to do the same thing to this left side of the row. Okay, so I have everything pinned that I need pinned, and I like to just kind of roll up my sewing. because I'll be starting at this end and then it can kind of rest in my lap and unroll as I need it to. So back to the sewing machine. Okay, so I am just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am just being mindful that all of my seams are staying pressed open on the front and the back, and I will just kind of pause with my needle down and reposition as needed to make sure that I get my blocks to line up as neatly as possible. That is my goal when I'm sewing these kind of quilt tops together. Okay, so now I have the first 2 rows together, and I am just going to double check that my seams all neatly meet up and everything is looking really good. Yeah, awesome. So I am just going to repeat this process for the rest of the rows, pinning at all of my block intersections. And just make sure as you're putting your rows together that you're staying in your offset pattern and everything is lining up according to the layout we set earlier. So, yep, I will see you in a minute when this quilt top is done. Okay, so the quilt top is now done, and I need to get this ready to take to my long arm quilters in a couple of days. And so that means I need to get the backing ready to go. Okay, so I know from the block size and layout I chose that this should measure 42.5 inches square. I am just going to confirm that using my cutting mat. Okay, yep. So this does measure 42.5 inches square. And so I did buy all of this fabric before I knew exactly what size quilt I was going to make. So I bought, let me see, I bought this blue gingham, blue buffalo check as the backing. And this is a 44-inch wide fabric. So I need to decide. I am doing the quilting myself. So anytime you're getting a quilt ready for a long armor, if you're going to drop it off with somebody, mail it to somebody, or somebody else is going to be doing the quilting, they will all have requirements for what you need to provide. And usually that is a backing that is 4 inches larger on each side, top, bottom, side to side, to give your quilter room for things to shift around. In this case, I am the long arm quilter. Meaning I have a little bit more flexibility in how much overhang I need, and how much overhang I need to provide myself. So I'm going to open up this fabric, which should be 44 inches wide, and see exactly how wide it is compared to my 42.5 inch quilt top, because ideally, I don't want to have to piece any extra fabric onto this, but I also don't want to leave myself absolutely no wiggle room, because that will just make my quilting life harder. So let's see how this compares to the quilt. Yeah, okay, so I really have about 1 inch. That is really not enough of overhang. I have plenty of length. I brought, I think, 2 yards of this fabric, so I have plenty of length. So I think what I'm going to do is probably cut some of the length and piece a panel onto the side. When I quilt it, I am going to try to make sure that I keep the quilt on the main part of the fabric and try not to go too much into the seamed piece. That way the back doesn't look like it's pieced. But because this baby quilt is 42.5 inches, you really do need more than just the 44 inches that the fabric gives you for backing. So yeah, that's just something I didn't think about when I was buying the fabric, but I will adjust for that now. Let me get this all cut out, and I'm gonna get my backing ready to take to the long arm quilt studio. Okay, so now this piece of fabric measures just under 44 inches wide. And now this is my excess fabric that I am going to use to piece extra width on the sides of the quilt. Okay, and I'm just cutting out a 6-inch wide strip, and then I'll cut another one to piece these end to end. Okay, so these two strips need to get sewn together end to end before I can attach them to the larger piece of backing. All right, I'm gonna take this to the sewing machine and get this attached, and then I think I will see you guys at the Long Arm Quilt Studio. Hi guys, I made it. It is Wednesday afternoon. I have the quilt top, backing, everything done, and I'm ready to get the quilt quilted. So I am going to be doing the long arm quilting myself here at Over the Top Quilting, which is my local long arm quilting studio. This segment will not be a tutorial. This is not my machine. I'm not, you know, qualified to film a tutorial on long arm quilting, but I will show you some clips of the quilting, and then I'll see you when it's time to bind the quilt. So let's go. Hi guys, it is now Saturday afternoon. The baby shower is tomorrow at 11 a.m. So I'm in a bit of a time crunch. So let's see how fast I can get my quilt finished. I need to trim it up and make the binding, add the binding, and then I'll wash it and then I'll be done. So let's do it. I got a little tuck in this quilt block, as you can see where the batting is sticking out about 1/4 inch away from the fabric. And so I'm gonna try and seam rip a couple spots so I can pull this fabric out, and that way this batting won't show, you know, when I'm binding it. That's the plan anyways. Let's see if it works. Okay, that looks much better. It'll be much easier to bind. Okay, the quilt is all trimmed up. I think it looks super, super cute. I'm really happy with how this quilt turned out. So now I need to just decide which of the fabrics I want to use as the binding. I think I'm just gonna go with this medium blue. Yeah, I'm gonna use the medium. Let's do it. I'm gonna cut out my binding strips at 2 1/4 inches. You are welcome to cut out whatever size you like. 2 1/2 inches is kind of the standard, most common size, but for smaller projects, especially like a baby quilt and bags, I've gotten used to doing 2 1/4 inches, and I really like the way it looks. So I'm gonna cut out 2 1/4 inch binding strips. Okay, and my quilt is 42 1/2 inches square, so I might only need 4 binding strips because the binding strips are going to be almost 44 inches, but since I'm going to join them on the bias, I'm going to go ahead and give myself 5 binding strips just in case I need a little bit of extra. Okay, so I lay 1 strip horizontal, I grab the next one and lay it vertically, and then I just sew corner to corner to attach my strips on the bias. Actually, I just realized I took my diagonal seam guide off, so let me put that back on because that really helps with sewing a nice 45-degree angle without having to mark anything. This is the diagonal seam tape from Cluck Cluck Sew that you can get a lot of places online and in your local quilt stores. And so then wherever these two pieces cross each other, I just make sure that's lined up on my red line so that I'm sewing in a straight line on that 45-degree angle. Okay, so one thing I realized I haven't done yet is add my label. And I am going to decide which is the bottom corner, and I'm going to add it to the back by ironing it down and then top stitching it into place. So let me do that real quick and then we'll add the binding. So that is what the label looks like on the back of the quilt. And on the front of the quilt, you can just kind of see where I sewed it on, but you won't really notice it once the quilt's bound and complete. But yeah, okay, I'm glad I remembered to put my label on it. Okay, so time to attach our binding. I like to sew my binding on from the wrong side, or from the back side of my quilt, so that I can wrap it around and top stitch it from the front side of my quilt. That's my favorite way to do machine binding. I feel like it gives me the most control and looks the nicest and neatest, so that is my preferred method. But of course, you can bind your quilt any way that you like. Let me give myself a little bit longer of a tail. You want to leave at least like maybe 4 or 5 inches of a tail so we can join our binding at the end. As I approach the corner, I like to stop a 1/4 inch from the edge and then come out 45 degrees to the corner. So that is why I have this little piece of tape here. The red line is even with my needle and the black line is a 1/4 inch away. So basically I can feel the edge of my quilt here. And I just go until it's lined up with that tape. And then I pivot my quilt so that the corner is coming straight down my red line now. So that creates a 45-degree angle. And then I just sew right through to the corner. And so your corner should look like this. And now I fold the binding straight up so that it is, oops, let me get this out of the way, so that the edge is kind of even with the next long edge of the quilt, and we make a 45-degree angle up into that corner. And then we fold straight back down and lay it down next to the edge we're going to sew, and that creates a nice little 45-degree turn in the corner. Okay, so I'm gonna leave myself maybe about 6 inches between the 2 tails of my binding where they meet. Okay, so for this binding, I am just going to do a straight seam join. You can also do a bias join. I usually find it more trouble than it's worth. I have much more success at getting my binding perfect when I do a straight seam. So unless I feel like it really needs it, I just tend to avoid joining on the bias. Okay, so I kind of find the midpoint, which looks about right there, and I make my binding kind of meet in the middle there. And I give it a really, really good finger press right there at those folds. So once you have your binding strips here in the middle and everything nice and finger pressed, then I cut a 1/4 inch away from that fold I just made. And then we're going to sew these 2 ends together on those fold lines that we just made, right sides together. I'm going to use a couple of pins to hold everything in place. And then I just kind of fold my quilt on itself to kind of keep everything out of the way. And then I will sew together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance right on those fold lines that I created. And then I just open up the seam we just made and finger press it open. And then fold it back on itself and make sure that it lays really nice and flat across that open space. What you don't want is to have like too much so that you create folds in your binding. You want it to lay really nice and flat. So if it's too big, unpick that seam and make it a little bit smaller. Okay, so now we have our binding all joined. I did get a tiny little tuck here, but it's only on the inside, so you won't see it when you fold it over. So it'll be fine. I should have just sewed my binding slightly tighter together. But now we're gonna flip this around and top stitch it to the front to finish the binding. So for top stitching, we're just folding over to the front and we're just trying to make the edge go right past where we sewed our binding onto the back. So we want to end up top stitching right next to that line of stitching that we already made. So you can definitely use binding clips like this if you prefer, but I usually tend to just do it by hand, and I only use the clips when I get to the corners. Okay, so as I get close to the corner, I pull up from the back and fold it over to the front, and I like to use some binding clips to hold everything into place to make the corner go a little bit easier. And so I put one up here, and then with the corner kind of having this 45-degree angle, I basically fold from the bottom up and try to make sure that this edge matches up with the other edge on the opposite side, and then I just sandwich everything with a binding clip to hold it in place until I get to the corner. I also like to use a stiletto tool when I'm doing my corners. This one is from K Facet by Annie. I also have by Annie stilettos, but yeah, there's a lot of different options out there. Just something, or you can use your seam ripper, honestly. And that's just to kind of use to poke and pull the binding where you want it and not have to get your fingers so close to the needle. So as I approach the corner, I can't leave my clip there, and so I use the tip of my stiletto to hold everything exactly where I want it. And as soon as the needle is inside of this bottom binding corner, then I flip and kind of go at a 45-degree angle. And I like to do about 2 or 3 stitches up into the corner of the binding. And then back. And then I turn and go down the next side. And so then here is what one finished corner looks like. I didn't do the best job on the back, but that's okay. I think it looks pretty nice, and I'm not gonna redo it. It's nice and secure. I just got a little off center on the back with that top stitching, but that's okay. All right, let me finish the rest of it. Okay, binding is complete. Oh, I think it looks so good. Hi guys. Okay, so it is Sunday morning. I am getting ready for the baby shower and I have the quilt all done. So yeah, I thought I would just do the outro to the video out here. I think the quilt turned out so stinking cute, and I cannot wait to go gift it to my cousin. If I can, I'll try to get a picture of her with it. Yeah, I think this is super fun, like super impactful with the way the blocks are laid out without like really that much effort. And you could make this in 100 different sizes and styles. So super happy with how this turned out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Yay. Okay, let's go gift a quilt.
This is really cute. This is from Liz. Okay. Ooh. Make it hard for me.